So you probably noticed that there are quite a bit of slides to go through. And if you haven't attended one of my webinars, you know it's going pretty fast through the topics. I really get a lot of joy with sharing information with everybody, and maybe I'm a little too overzealous, but I'll try and keep at the pace and we'll cover the material. And please, if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A box. This provides an overview of what we're going to discuss, and just a little background from my point of view as being a structural engineer. When I was a structural engineer in the private sector, I really didn't know a whole lot about fire protection. And then it's only until I joined the wood industry is where I really got to get a grasp of how important it is as a structural engineer and dealing with design and working with architects, how important it is to understand fire protection, just basics, just to have the vocabulary to talk with an architect. And when you think about it, and I'm assuming most of you are structural engineers, I could be wrong, but I think most of you are structural engineers, or you deal with plan review, code check, and all of that. But the importance of all of this is who actually chooses the actual structural material and what the structure will be made of. I would hope that as structural engineers, we would have some say in what type of structure, what type of material is going to use in that structure. And that's what the basis is for me in presenting this, is to provide engineers and architects and code officials with the knowledge to help understand some of the process that goes through with selecting the type of construction and the size of the building, et cetera, et cetera. So as an overview of what we're going to talk about, the introduction will cover principles of fire resistance design, heights and areas, and half of the presentation is going to be covering this, providing basics. And then we'll look into how to achieve fire resistance and how does that relate to us as engineers and what we need to know about fire resistance. And then we'll touch on some design examples. Probably won't dive too deep into it because there are some really good design examples in TR10, which is a American Wood Council document that's available for free on their website. It's a really good publication that goes in really deep into several design examples for fire resistance by calculated design method. So right off the bat, we'll go into introduction. Now, throughout this whole presentation, obviously we're going to talk about fire protection and fire resistance. And when we look at the code, the building code looks at fire and life safety. And there's some the characteristics of fire protection and smoke protection. There's some high-level concepts that we're going to cover throughout this presentation. So the first one is structural fire resistance, protecting the structure in the event of a fire. We want to be able to have that structure stand up so that the occupants can exit the building safely, and so the firefighters first responders can go in and hopefully put out the fire. Then we're going to look at it. The other concept is limitation of fire spread. In the event that there is a fire, we don't want that fire to spread throughout the building. So we want to have fire barriers to protect and mitigate against fire spread. Then there's protection of exit ways. We want to be able to provide a pathway for the occupants to exit the building safely. And then radiant heat exposure. This has to do with our exterior walls, and if there is a fire within the building, we want to prevent that fire from spreading to an adjacent building. And then restriction of smoke movement. And this has more to do with those types of buildings that have occupants that have limited capability of moving and getting out of the building by themselves. That's most of what that has to do with is but there are other areas in the code that require some protection of smoke. So when we talk about the size of a building and looking at what determines the size of the building, two concepts that we'll talk about is occupancy and construction type. Knowing these two and understanding these two is very important, and determining that at the beginning of the design of the building, establishing what this is, because from there leads to all the other information that we need to know about determining the size of the building, determining what fire protection, determining what protection and sprinklers we require, if required, et cetera, et cetera. So the very important step is occupancy and construction type. And then beyond that, those two characteristics is how do we increase the building beyond knowing the occupancy and the construction site?